24th of January 1975, 50 years ago, and a concert that shouldn't have happened. Forget Taylor Swift's era level of organisation. This was a relatively small performance in a relatively small concert hall in Cologne, in Germany. The performer was tired after a long 600-kilometre drive from Switzerland, where he'd played his previous concert only a couple of days earlier. His energy level was low, plus he had back pain from a nagging problem which, sitting for hours in the old Renault 4 belonging to his record producer, hadn't helped. He was committed to the evening because it was a recording session. His company wanted a live concert. This seemed like a good option. The venue was impressive. The old Cologne Opera House, site of some of the greatest concerts in musical history going back centuries. But this time, something had gone badly wrong with the planning, at least as far as the piano on which he was supposed to play was concerned. On a stage normally associated with the finest instruments, Steinways, Bechsteins, Bosendorfers and the like, there'd been a mix-up. The instrument which had been requested was a Bosendorfer 290 Imperial. Unfortunately, the backstage staff had misinterpreted this and instead wheeled out a much smaller Bosendorfer Baby Grand, a piano normally only used for backstage rehearsals and warm-ups. This wasn't in the best of condition. Its sound was tinny and thin in the upper registers and weak in the bass. The pedals didn't work properly, and the machine was badly in need of tuning. The organisers desperately tried to secure a replacement instrument, but were told that even if one could be found, transporting it across town in the middle of the rainstorm, which had just started outside, would risk damaging it badly. So instead, a piano tuner set to work to try and minimise the problems of the smaller instrument with several heroic hours of attention. Not surprisingly, our performer's first reaction on arriving and discovering all of this was to climb back in his car and drive away. There are limits, especially when what you really want is a long soak in a hot bath, perhaps a couple of painkillers, washed down with a cheering drink. But Vera Brandes, the 18-year-old woman who had organised the concert, pleaded with him. She'd put everything she could into the event and managed to sell it out. But her would-be career as an impresario might be cut short before she started, if he didn't perform. The audience faced disappointment. She faced ruin if the concert didn't happen. As she put it, "If you don't play tonight, I'm going to be well and truly..." Dramatic perhaps, but it touched a nerve, and he agreed to go back into the hall and see whether they could salvage anything. The concert was scheduled as a late-night event, beginning after an earlier opera performance had finished. So with the piano tuner working away in the background, even as he warmed his hands, the young pianist tried to get his mind in gear. The performance was to be in his signature style, a series of improvisations. So his mind needed to be able to rise above the challenges and somehow create space for, well, creating. At 11:30 p.m., with a loyal audience of 1,300 people in their seats and patiently waiting, the auditorium bell began to ring to signal the start of the show. He took his cue from this, echoing the bell's notes as the first bars of his improvisation. And so began a performance which has become a legend, and thanks to the fact that it doubled as a recording session, one which was captured for others to enjoy. And it still entrances 50 years later. The Köln concert is arguably Keith Jarrett's most famous work, and probably the one which best demonstrates his enormous talent for improvisation. Despite, or perhaps because of, the conditions being so unfavorable, he spun a web of genius, soaring from one rippling idea to the next with hardly a pause in between. His first piece lasted 26 minutes, and after the briefest of gaps, he began a second, which went on for 48 improvised minutes. At the end of the show, there was silence, followed by rapturous applause. Something magical had happened and is still remembered, 50 years and 4 million copies of the album on. Winners of multiple awards, it's still the best-selling solo piano album of all time. And it has a lot to offer as an object lesson in the art of innovation. First, it's useful to remind ourselves that innovation isn't always about having plenty of resources. In these straitened times, there's a lot of concern that this will drive out innovation. But as Jarrett demonstrated, sometimes creativity loves constraints. From the most unpropitious of circumstances, he was able to create something radically different. That old phrase, "if life gives you lemons, make lemonade," has often been used to describe the entrepreneurial skills around effectuation. And that was certainly a characteristic of this concert. Faced with the challenges imposed by the instrument, he used various techniques, like rolling left-hand figures to augment that weak bass sound, while he concentrated his playing in the middle of the keyboard. He was forced to jump the tracks, follow a different line to the musically normal, getting out of the box. Now, he's not alone. We've actually got many examples in the innovation field where crisis and constraint have been powerful agents in forcing new directions. Think of the revolution in manufacturing which the lean thinking movement brought about, one which spread to services and then the public sector. It's an approach which has changed the world, but it was born on the heavily constrained factory floors of post-war Japan. Faced with shortages of expensive raw materials, a lack of equipment, lack of money, lack of skilled labor, they were forced to find new ways of working. And they evolved a suite of process innovations which have changed the world. Or our more recent experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, where the crisis conditions forced new approaches and forged new ways of solving the problems posed by the pandemic, not least in protective equipment and in vaccine development. And this is, sadly, the kind of context in which humanitarian agencies operate all the time, trying to mitigate suffering and improve conditions under severe constraints. Importantly, solutions developed in this space not only represent impressive examples of frugal innovation, they use limited resources, but they often signpost new trajectories for wider application. So developing the capabilities for working in crisis conditions as the norm builds powerful entrepreneurial capabilities which can be redeployed in other situations. It's a bit like cold water swimming, which is now associated with wider health benefits. That shock of having to work under different conditions might end up being an important strategic aid. Interestingly, there's growing research into this idea of forced crisis as a source of creativity. Artists have often tried to force their work in new directions by introducing constraints. Record producer Brian Eno is famous for his use of a deck of cards, what he calls his oblique strategies, which effectively randomizes roles and behaviors in a recording studio, forcing just the kind of crisis which confronted Keith Jarrett. And the results are similarly impressive. Some great work by artists like David Bowie or U2 owes a lot to his technique. Or Lars von Trier, the film director, who used a similar approach in his film appropriately titled The 5 Obstructions, which documents the challenges he posed to fellow filmmaker Jürgen Leth in order to try and force new creative pathways. Now, in Jarrett's experience, there's also more than a little of another skill we associate with entrepreneurs: bricolage. That's the ability to make something out of what's available, not wishing for what isn't, and then creatively combining it to make something new. Once again, we've got plenty of innovation reference points. Dr. Willem Kolff, the father of dialysis, was the Dutch physician who constructed the first kidney dialyzer in 1943 in the occupied city of Groningen in the Netherlands. Because materials were so scarce during that time, Kolff had to improvise, and this resulted in the first dialyzer being made from sausage skins, orange juice cans, and old washing machine parts. Or General Electric's very simple but incredibly successful ECG machine, the Mac 400, this was originally developed for use in rural India, but it's become widely successful in many other markets because of its simplicity and low cost. It was actually developed in 18 months for a 60% lower product cost, and yet offers most of the key functions needed by healthcare professionals. It actually cost only $800 compared to $2,000 for a conventional ECG machine, and it reduced the costs of doing an ECG to just $1, around 50 rupees per patient. And newer versions have reduced this further to just 10 rupees per scan. But a key part of this frugal approach was the reuse of ideas and technology developed elsewhere and then combined with adapting off-the-shelf parts. For example, the machine's printer is an adaptation of one originally used in bus terminal kiosks across India. Now there's a third element we can see in Jarrett's experience, this idea of taking risks and learning by doing. Prototyping on the fly. Now Jarrett's style is classic improvisation, picking an idea and then running with it. In comedy and theatre improvisation, it's that yes and moment, not pausing to critique or to wonder, but rather trying stuff out to see where it might take you, moving on where it isn't working, but where it does seem to resonate, building on that, climbing inside, refining and developing. Now, we'd call that pivoting in today's agile innovation speak, but it's the essence of Jarrett's approach. It's the opposite of planned music or playing the notes as written. This is emergence, using sensitivity, feedback, amplification of weak signals, half-sense hints of the direction in which to go. Another theme illuminated by that concert experience is that of reframing. Now, crisis as a word comes originally from the Greek, where it means turning point. In Chinese, the concept is represented by two characters placed next to each other, one meaning threat, the other opportunity. In other words, a crisis poses a problem but invites new perspectives which can create opportunity from it. Now, only Keith Jarrett knows what actually caused him to decide to play that concert. Contractual commitments, the fact that the equipment was already set up, or perhaps loyalty to his friend and his one-time chauffeur, his driver, Manfred Eicher of ECM Records. Or perhaps those desperate pleas of the young Vera Brandes. Or maybe that intrinsic challenge of somehow pulling off the impossible. But whatever it was, the decision forced a reframing of the disaster to create an opportunity. And as the evening progressed, the crowd sensed that they were experiencing something very different and special, watching a new creative pathway being forged. But it's not just the ability to reframe, nor that courage to risk and experiment which is behind the success of the evening. For Keith Jarrett, it wasn't just crisis forcing his hand, or rather hands, dancing across the keyboard. He was able to explore and experiment because of an underlying technical capability, the result of years of practice and a honing of the capabilities which allowed him to improvise. He had to deploy them in new ways to reconfigure for a particularly challenging circumstance, but he was able to build on well-rehearsed behavioral routines. Now, this matches closely to what David Teese and colleagues call dynamic capability. The ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external resources and competencies to address and shape rapidly changing business environments. It's not a reflex response or a plug-and-play solution to new circumstances, but instead a learned, rehearsed set of behavioral routines. So, if you're looking for a new source of inspiration for innovation, getting away from the gadgetry of the recent CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, or the juggernaut of AI, then if you are looking for some inspiration, you could do a lot worse than have a quiet listen, or perhaps a listen again, to that Cologne concert. 50 years on, it's still got a lot to offer.